My beloved child, there was a moment when he genuinely believed the chapter between you had finally closed, and what happened next was so quiet that nobody around him understood its significance. He had started convincing himself that he was getting used to your absence. He stopped looking for reminders of you. He became better at carrying on with ordinary days, ordinary conversations, ordinary routines. And someone close to him noticed that change. That third party looked at him and thought, he's finally moved on. That was the mistake. Because moving forward and letting go are not always the same thing. Sometimes a person can continue living while one particular connection remains quietly unfinished inside them. Stay till the end, because the unexpected thing that pulled him back was not what anyone expected, and it began with something incredibly small. It happened during an ordinary moment when he wasn't searching for you at all. A familiar phrase came up in conversation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, it immediately reminded him of the way you used to understand him without forcing him to explain every feeling. He tried to brush it aside. Then another memory surfaced. This time, it wasn't about what you said. It was about how he felt around you. That was when something shifted. He realized he had been measuring his progress by how often he thought about you, when the deeper truth was that he had been measuring it incorrectly. You weren't simply a memory he was trying to forget. You had become connected to a part of himself he hadn't fully understood until you were gone. And suddenly, the confidence he had shown that he was moving on began to feel different. The third party noticed the change before he admitted it himself. His attention became distant. His answers became shorter. He started questioning things he had previously accepted without hesitation. Then came the moment that changed everything. He encountered something connected to you that he had never expected to see again. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a dramatic reunion. It was something much more personal, something that carried a meaning only the two of you could truly understand. He stood there quietly, realizing that what he had called moving on might actually have been nothing more than learning how to live without confronting what he still felt. And that realization opened a question he had been avoiding for far too long. If he had truly moved on, why did one unexpected reminder of you still have the power to stop him in his tracks? But that wasn't even the part that brought him back. The real turning point came afterward, when someone else said one sentence to him that forced him to look at your connection completely differently, and that sentence is where everything begins to change. One sentence should not have been enough to shake everything he had carefully settled inside himself, yet somehow, it did. He had been standing there trying to explain away the feeling when the third party looked at him and quietly said something he wasn't prepared to hear. You don't talk about them like someone you've forgotten. He didn't answer. That silence said more than words could have. Because suddenly, he realized other people had noticed what he had been trying not to notice himself. The way his expression changed whenever your name came up. The way he remembered tiny details about you that he had no reason to remember anymore. The way certain places still carried an emotional weight he couldn't explain. He had convinced himself that these things meant nothing. But now someone else had put them into words. And once you hear something like that, it becomes difficult to pretend you never noticed it. Don't skip this part, because what happened next revealed why the third party had become so confident that you were finally out of his heart. For a while, he really had looked different. He had stopped bringing you into conversations. He seemed calmer. He laughed more. He allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't include the possibility of you returning. The third party interpreted that calmness as closure. But they had misunderstood what was happening underneath. He wasn't necessarily forgetting you. He was becoming tired of fighting the memories. There is a difference. Sometimes a person stops speaking about someone because speaking about them makes the unfinished feelings too real. And that was exactly what seemed to be happening with him. Then, unexpectedly, he came across something from the past that he had never deleted. He had forgotten it was still there. For a few seconds, he simply stared at it. There was no dramatic reaction, no grand declaration, only a quiet realization that made his chest feel strangely heavy. He had preserved something connected to you without even realizing he had been preserving it. That tiny discovery brought back a question he thought he had already answered. What if I never actually stopped caring? He tried to push the thought away, but this time it followed him. The third party noticed immediately. And what happened after that was even more revealing. He began comparing the life he had built after you with the feeling he remembered having when you were still part of it. Not because everything around him was wrong, but because something felt incomplete in a way he could no longer ignore. Then came the moment nobody expected. He didn't reach for you immediately. Instead, he did something much quieter. He went back to the place where he could think clearly, sat alone with the memories he had avoided, and finally admitted the truth he had been resisting. He wasn't being pulled backward by the past. He was being pulled toward an unanswered question. And the next thing he discovered about that question would make him realize why you had remained so difficult to leave behind. Something he had overlooked for months suddenly made the entire situation look different. He kept thinking the reason he couldn't fully let go was because of nostalgia, because of memories, because of the history you shared. But that night, sitting alone with his thoughts, he realized it wasn't any of those things. What kept returning was a feeling he had never properly named. It was the sense that something between you had been left unfinished. Not necessarily because you were meant to return to the past, but because neither of you had truly understood what the connection had changed inside you. Stay with me, because this is where his behavior began changing in a way even the third party couldn't explain. He started noticing how often ordinary moments reminded him of you. A song playing quietly somewhere. A phrase someone used. A familiar place appearing unexpectedly. None of these things were extraordinary, yet together they formed a pattern he could no longer dismiss. And then he remembered something even more important, the last meaningful conversation you had. At the time, he had focused on what was said. Now he was beginning to understand what had remained unsaid. That realization stayed with him. He began wondering whether his decision to move forward had been based on genuine peace or simply on the belief that enough time had passed. There was a difference, and suddenly he could feel it. The third party saw him becoming quieter again and assumed something had gone wrong. But nothing had gone wrong. Something had become clear. He wasn't suddenly unhappy with his life. He was simply no longer willing to pretend that one part of his heart had never mattered. Then came an unexpected detail that changed the direction of everything. Someone mentioned you without knowing what had been happening inside him. They casually said something positive about you, something simple, almost forgettable. Yet his reaction was immediate. He didn't defend you. He didn't explain anything. He simply smiled for a moment, and that smile revealed more than he intended. The third party saw it. This time, they couldn't misunderstand it. They realized that whatever he had been calling moving on, there was still something alive beneath it. But the most surprising part was what happened afterward. Instead of immediately reaching out, he began asking himself a harder question: if he contacted you, what would he actually say? Would he apologize? Would he explain why he disappeared? Would he admit that he had tried to move forward and discovered that the feeling had never completely disappeared? He didn't have an answer. And that uncertainty became the very thing that kept him awake. Then, just when he thought he needed to make a decision, he discovered one final piece of the story, something connected to you that he had never known before. It wasn't what he expected to find, and once he understood what it meant, the third party's confidence began to disappear completely, because suddenly, he wasn't only thinking about coming back. He was wondering whether you had been waiting for the same answer all along. The message was never meant to reach him, yet somehow it did. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't an invitation. It was simply a small piece of information about you that reached him through someone else, and the moment he heard it, his entire understanding of the distance between you changed. He had assumed you had probably moved on too. That assumption had been the one thing making it easier for him to stay away. But now he heard that your life had continued in a way he hadn't expected, while some part of you still carried the lessons from what happened between you. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but it awakened something he had been trying to keep quiet. Don't skip this moment, because for the first time, he wasn't thinking only about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he might have misunderstood. He remembered the times you had tried to communicate and how he had interpreted your silence. He remembered moments when you seemed distant and assumed you no longer cared. And suddenly, another possibility appeared: maybe you had both been protecting yourselves while secretly hoping the other person would make the first move. That thought unsettled him. Not because it guaranteed anything, but because it made him question how many moments had been misread. Meanwhile, the third party began noticing that his attention was no longer fully present. Conversations would begin normally, but somewhere in the middle, his mind would drift. He wasn't comparing people. He wasn't searching for someone better. He was confronting a connection that had never received a proper ending. Then something unexpected happened. He came across an old detail from the period when you were together, something you had once said that he hadn't understood at the time. Back then, he thought you were simply emotional. Now, with distance, he finally understood the deeper meaning behind your words. You had not been asking him for perfection. You had been asking him to be honest about what he truly felt. And he realized that honesty was exactly what he had avoided. That realization softened him. For the first time, he stopped blaming circumstances, timing, or misunderstandings. He began looking at his own choices. And when a person finally reaches that point, the story changes. He wasn't being dragged backward by memories anymore. He was being pulled forward by clarity. But clarity brought a decision he could no longer postpone. He picked up his phone, stared at your name, and hesitated. One message could reopen a door he had spent so long trying to close. No message could leave the question alive for years. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then, just before he made his choice, something appeared that he could never have predicted. It was connected to you, and it gave him one final reason to stop pretending that staying away was the easier choice. The screen stayed silent for several seconds, but his expression changed before he even understood why. What appeared in front of him wasn't the dramatic sign he might have imagined. It was something ordinary, almost easy to overlook, yet it carried a meaning that reached much deeper. He realized that the thing he had been waiting for wasn't proof that you still belonged in his life. It was proof that he could finally approach the truth without running from it. And that distinction changed him. For months, he had treated returning to you like going backward. Now he understood that sometimes going back to an unfinished conversation is actually the first step toward moving forward. Stay with me, because this was the moment the third party finally realized they had misunderstood him completely. They had believed his calmness meant he had chosen a different future. But his calmness had only been the surface. Underneath it, he had been carrying a question he couldn't answer. And now that question had become impossible to ignore. He opened the conversation with you again. He didn't immediately type anything. He simply looked at the old messages and noticed how much emotion was hidden inside ordinary words. A simple, "take care," suddenly sounded different. A short reply suddenly carried the weight of everything neither of you had said. He remembered how quickly you had tried to understand him, even when he wasn't making it easy. He remembered the moments when you gave him space instead of forcing an answer. And that was when the unexpected pull became clearer. It wasn't only that he missed you. He missed the version of himself that existed when he felt genuinely understood. That realization made him put the phone down for a moment. He knew that if he returned, he couldn't return with the same habits, the same silence, or the same uncertainty. Something had to be different. The third party sensed that change and tried to understand what had happened. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply said something that revealed how far his thoughts had gone. "I don't think I ever really finished that story." Those words carried no promise, but they carried honesty. And honesty was exactly what had been missing. Then, after sitting with the thought for one more moment, he finally began typing. Not a long message. Not an emotional speech. Just a few carefully chosen words. But before he could send them, another thought stopped him cold, not because he was afraid of your response, but because he suddenly wondered whether you had already received a message from someone else. And if you had, the entire situation was about to become far more complicated than he realized. His thumb stopped above the screen because one possibility suddenly changed everything. What if you already knew someone was thinking about you again? What if the silence between you had not been as empty as he believed? He stared at the unfinished message, realizing that the hardest part wasn't sending it. The hardest part was accepting that he couldn't control what happened after it was sent. For so long, he had protected himself by assuming you had moved on. That assumption had allowed him to stay quiet without feeling responsible for the distance. But now, for the first time, he understood something painfully simple. Silence can feel safe until you realize it may also be costing you something meaningful. Don't skip this moment, because what happened next wasn't about a dramatic reunion. It was about a decision. He finally typed a sentence, erased it, typed another, and erased that too. Every version sounded either too distant or too emotional. Then he remembered the one thing you had once asked from him without ever demanding it: honesty. So he stopped trying to create the perfect message. He wrote what he actually felt. There's something I never finished saying. He read it twice. His heart raced, but he didn't delete it. Meanwhile, the third party was beginning to understand that whatever connection existed between you and him had never truly disappeared. They had mistaken quietness for closure. They had mistaken routine for certainty. And now they were watching him reach a point where another person's presence could no longer distract him from his own unanswered feelings. He pressed send. For a moment, nothing happened. No response. No sign. Just silence. Yet strangely, he felt lighter. Because for the first time, he had stopped trying to predict your reaction and simply told the truth. Then his phone lit up. One notification. His eyes moved to the screen, and everything inside him became still. Your name was there. He opened the message expecting anything: anger, distance, confusion, perhaps nothing he could understand. But the first line made him stop breathing for a second. You hadn't asked why he was contacting you. You hadn't asked what had changed. You had simply written something that suggested you had been carrying your own unanswered question. And suddenly, the story he thought was only happening inside him became something much bigger. Because your next words revealed that you had noticed the same strange unfinished feeling, but there was one detail you hadn't told him. A detail that explained why you had stayed silent for so long, and once he read it, he finally understood why the third party had never truly been the biggest obstacle between you. For the first time, he wasn't looking at your name with uncertainty, he was looking at it with recognition. Your message revealed that your silence had never meant indifference. You had been holding back because you believed he had already chosen another direction, and you didn't want to become the person who interrupted a life he seemed comfortable living. That sentence stayed with him. He read it again, slowly, realizing how easily two people can care deeply and still remain separated when both are waiting for the other to speak first. The third party had believed they were the reason he had moved on, but now he understood something more complicated. The real distance between you had been created by assumptions. You thought he had stopped caring. He thought you had stopped caring. And while both of you were protecting yourselves from rejection, time quietly turned the silence into something that looked like closure. Stay till the end, because what happened after that finally brought the unexpected pull from the title into focus. He asked you one simple question: if you thought I had moved on, why did you answer me now? Your response came after a pause. You told him that when his message appeared, you felt the same strange familiarity you had felt when you first met him, not because nothing had changed, but because something important had survived the changes. You had grown. He had grown. The circumstances were different. But the feeling of being understood had never completely disappeared. He sat quietly after reading that. There was no dramatic celebration. Instead, there was relief. The kind of relief that comes when someone finally says the thing you've been afraid to admit to yourself. And then he realized what had actually pulled him back. It wasn't a coincidence, a memory, or another person's influence. It was clarity. He had finally become honest enough to recognize what his heart had been trying to tell him beneath all the noise. The third party could no longer compete with that realization because there was nothing to compete with. This wasn't about choosing one person over another. It was about choosing honesty over avoidance. He told you he didn't want to pretend the past could simply be erased, but he also didn't want to force the future to become something it wasn't. He wanted one real conversation. No assumptions.